Eye of the World, Wheel of Time, Eye of the World by Robert Jordan, Chapter 2. When Rand and Mat carried the first barrels through the common room, Master Alvaire was already filling a pair of mugs with his best brown ale, his own make, from one of the casks racked against the wall. Scratch, the inn's yellow cat, crouched atop it with his eyes closed and his tail wrapped around his feet. Tam stood in front of the big fireplace of River Rock, thumbing a long steamed pipe full of tabac from a polished canister the innkeeper always kept on the plain stone mantel. The fireplace stretched half a length of the big square room, with a lintel as high as a man's shoulder, and the crackling blaze of the hearth vanquished the chill outside. At that time of the busy day before festival, Rand expected to find the common room empty except for Bran and his father, and the cat. But 4 more members of the village council, including Sen, sat in high-backed chairs in front of the fire, mugs in hand, and blue-gray pipe smoke wreathing their heads. For once, none of the stone boards were in use, and all of Bran's books stood idle on the shelf opposite the fireplace. The men did not even talk, peering slightly into their ale or tapping pipe streams against their teeth in impatience as they waited for Tam and Bran to join them. Worry was not uncommon for the village council these days, not in Emond's Field, and likely not in Watch Hill or Devon Ride, or even Terran Ferry, though who knew what Terran Ferry folk really thought about anything. Only 2 of the men before the fire, Harold Luhan, the blacksmith, and John Thane, the miller, so much as glanced at the boys as they entered. Master Luhan, though, made it more than a glance. The blacksmith's arms were as big as most men's legs, roped with heavy muscle, and he still wore his long leather apron, as if he had hurried to the meeting straight from the forge. His frown took them both in, and then he straightened around in his chair deliberately, turning his attention back to an over-studious tapping of his pipe with a thick thumb. Curious, Rand slowed, then barely bit back a yelp as Mat kicked his ankle. His friend nodded insistently toward the doorway at the back of the common room and hurried on without waiting. Limping slightly, Rand followed less quickly. "What was that about?" he demanded as soon as he was in the hall that led to the kitchen. "You almost broke my—" "It's old Luhan," Mat said, peering past Rand's shoulder into the common room. "I think he suspects I was the one who—" He cut off abruptly as Mistress Alvaire bustled out of the kitchen, the aroma of fresh baked bread wafting ahead of her. The tray in her hands carried some of the crusty loaves for which she was famous around Emond's Field, as well as plates of pickles and cheese. The food reminded Rand abruptly that he had eaten only an end of bread before leaving the farm that morning. His stomach gave an embarrassing rumble. A slender woman, with her thick braid of graying hair pulled over one shoulder, Mistress Alvaire smiled in a motherly fashion that took in both of them. "There is more of this in the kitchen if you 2 are hungry, and I never knew boys your age who weren't, or any other age for that matter. If you prefer, I'm baking honey cakes this morning." She was one of the few married women in the area who never tried to play matchmaker with Tam. Toward Rand, her motherliness extended to warm smiles and a quick snack whenever he came by the inn, and she did not as much for every young man in the area. If she occasionally looked at him as if she wanted to do more, at least she took it no further than looks, for which he was deeply grateful. Without waiting for a reply, she swept on into the common room. Immediately, there was a sound of chairs scraping on the floor as the men got to their feet and exclaims over the smell of bread. She was easily the best cook in Emond's Field, and not a man for miles around but eagerly leapt at a chance to put his feet under her table. "Honey cakes," Matt said, smacking his lips. "After," Rand told him firmly, "or we'll never get done." A lamp hung over the cellar stairs just beside the kitchen door, and another made a bright pool in the stone-walled room beneath the inn, banishing all but a little dimness in the furthest corners. Wooden racks along the walls across the floor held casks of brandy and cider, and larger barrels of ale and wine, some with taps driven in. Many of the wine barrels were marked with the chalk in Bran al'Veir's hand, giving the year they had been bought, what peddler had brought them, and in which city they had been made. But all of the ale and brandy was made of Two Rivers farmers or Bran himself. Peddlers and even merchants sometimes brought brandy or ale from outside, but it was never as good as and cost the earth besides, and nobody ever drank it more than once. "Now," Rand said as they set their casks in the racks, "what did you do that you had to avoid Master Luhan?" Matt shrugged. "Nothing really. I told Aiden Alcar and some of his snot-nosed friends, Ewan Fingar and Day Complin, that some farmers had been seen ghost hounds, breathing and fire and running through the woods. They ate it up like clotted cream." "And Master Luhan is mad at you for that?" Rand said doubtfully. "Not exactly." Matt paused, then shook his head. "You see, I covered 2 of his dogs with flour, so they were all white. Then I let them loose in your Dag's house. How was I to know they'd run straight home? It really isn't my fault if Mistress Luhan hadn't left the door open. They couldn't have gotten inside. It isn't like I intended to get flour all over her house." He gave a bark of laughter. "I hear she chased old Luhan and the dogs, all 3 out of the house with a broom." Rand winced and laughed at the same time. "If I were you, I'd worry more about Alset Luhan than the blacksmith. She's almost as strong, and her temper is a lot worse. No matter, though. If you walk fast, maybe he won't notice you." Matt's expression said he did not think Rand was funny. When they went back through the common room, though, there was no need for Matt to hurry. The 6 men had their chairs in a tight knot before the fireplace. With his back to the fire, Tam was speaking in a low voice, and the others were leaning forward to listen, so intent on his words they would likely not have noticed if a flock of sheep had been driven through. Rand wanted to move closer, to hear what they were talking about, but Matt plucked at his sleeve and gave him an agonized look. With a sigh, he followed Matt out to the cart. On the return to the hallway, they found a tray by the top of the steps, and hot honey cakes filling the hall with their sweet aroma. There were 2 mugs as well, and a pitcher of streaming mulled cider. Despite his own abomination about waiting until later, Rand found himself making the last 2 trips between cart and cellar while trying to juggle a cask and a piping hot honey cake. Setting his final cask in the racks, he wiped crumbs from his mouth while Matt was unburdening himself, then said, "Now, for the glee." Feet clattered on the stairs, and Ewan Finger half fell into the cellar in his haste, his pudgy face shining with eagerness to impart his news. "There are strangers in the village." He caught his breath and gave Matt a wary look. "I haven't seen any ghost hounds, but I hear somebody flowered Master Luhan's dogs. I hear Mistress Luhan has ideas who to look for, too." The years separating Rand and Matt from Eowyn, only 14, were usually more than enough to give them to give short shrift to anything he had to say. This time they exchanged one startled glance, then both were talking at once. "In the village?" Rand asked. "Not in the woods?" Right on top of him, Matt added, "Was his cloak black? Could you see his face?" Eowyn looked uncertain from one of them to the other, then spoke quickly when Matt took a threatening step. "Of course I could see his face. And his cloak is green, or maybe gray. It changes. It seems to fade into whatever he's standing. Sometimes you don't see him even when you look right at him, not unless he moves. And Hers, it's blue, like the sky, and 10 times fancier than any feast day clothes I ever saw. She's 10 times prettier than anybody I ever saw, too. She's a highborn lady, like in the stories. She must be. Her? Rand said. Who are you talking about? He stared at Matt, who had put both hands on top of his head and squeezed his eyes shut. They're the ones I meant to tell you about, Matt muttered, before you got me off onto... He cut off, opening his eyes for a sharp glance at Eowyn. They arrived last evening, Matt went on after a moment, and took rooms here at the inn. I saw them ride in. Their horses, Rand. I never saw horses so tall, or so sleek. They looked like they could run forever. I think he works for her. In service, Eowyn broke. They call it being in service in the stories. Matt continued as if Aaron had not spoken. Anyway, he defers to her, does what she says. Only he isn't like a hired man. A soldier, maybe, the way he wears his sword. It's part of him, like his hand or his foot. He makes the merchants' guards look cure dogs. And her, Rand, I never imagined anyone like her. She's out of a Gleeman story. She's like... He paused to give Eowyn a sour look. Like a highborn lady, he finished with a sigh. But who are they? Rand asked, except for merchants once a year to buy tabak and wool, and the peddlers outside never came into the Two Rivers, or as good as never. Maybe at Terran Ferry, but not this far south. Most of the merchants and peddlers had been coming for years, too, so if they did not really count as strangers, just outsiders. It was a good 5 years since the last time a real stranger appeared in Emond's Field, and he had been trying to hide from some sort of trouble up in Bear Lawn that nobody in the village understood. He had not stayed long. What do they want? What do they want? Matt exclaimed. I don't care what they want. Strangers, Rand, and strangers like you never even dreamed of. Think of it. Rand opened his mouth, then closed it without speaking. The black-cloaked rider had him as nervous as a cat in a dog run. It just seemed like an awful coincidence. 3 strangers around the village at the same time. 3, if this fellow's cloak that changed colors never changed to black. Her name is Moraine, Eowyn said into the monetary silence. I heard him say it. Moraine, he called her. The Lady Moraine. His name is Lan. The Wisdom may not like her, but I do. What makes you think Nynaeve dislikes her? Rand said. She asked the Wisdom for directions this morning, Eowyn said, and called her child. Rand and Matt both whistled softly through their teeth, and Eowyn tripped over his tongue in his haste to explain. The Lady Moraine didn't know she was the Wisdom. She apologized when she found out, she did, and asked some questions about herbs and about who is who around Emond's Field, just as respectfully as any woman in the village. More so than some. She's always asking questions about how old people are and how long they've lived where they live and, oh, I don't know what all. Anyway, Nynaeve answered like she'd bitten a green strawberry. Then, when the Lady Moraine walked away, Nynaeve started after her well, it wasn't friendly, I can tell you that. Is that all? Rand said. You know Nynaeve's temper. When Sendri called her a child last year, she thumped him on the head with her stick, and he's on the village council, and old enough to be her grandfather, besides. She flares up at anything, and never stays angry past turning around. It's too long for me, Eowyn muttered. I don't care who Nynaeve thumps, Matt chortled, so long as it isn't me. This is going to be the best Beltane ever. A Gleeman, a lady who could ask for more, who needs fireworks. A Gleeman, Eowyn said, his voice rising sharply. Come on, Rand, Matt went on, ignoring the younger boy. We're done here. You have to see this fellow. He bounded up the stairs with Eowyn scrambling behind him, calling, Is there really a Gleeman, Matt? This isn't like the ghost towns, is it? Or the frogs? Rand paused long enough to turn down the lamp, then hurried after them. In the common room, Rowan Hearn and Samuel Crawl had joined the others in front of the fire, so that the entire village council was there. Bran Alver spoke now, normally bluff voice pitched so low that only a rumbling murmur traveled beyond the close-gathered chairs. The mayor emphasized his words by tapping a thick finger into the palm of his other hand and eyed each man in turn. They all nodded in agreement with whatever he was saying, though Sen more reluctantly than the rest. The way the men all huddled together spoke more plainly than a painted sign. Whatever they were talking about, it was for the village council alone, at least for now. They would not appreciate Rand trying to listen in. Reluctantly, he pulled himself away. There were still the Gleeman, and those strangers. Outside, Bella and the cart were gone, taken away by Hugh or Tad, the inn stablemen. Mat and Eowyn stood glaring at one another a few paces from the front door of the inn, their cloaks whipping in the wind. "For the last time," Mat barked, "I am not playing a trick on you. There is a Gleeman. Now go away. Rand, will you tell this woolhead I am telling the truth so he'll leave me alone?" Pulling his cloak together, Rand stepped forward to support Mat, but words died as the hairs stirred on the back of his neck. He was being watched again. It was far from the feeling the hooded rider had given him, but neither was it pleasant, especially so soon after that encounter. A quick look about the green showed him only what he had seen before. Children playing, people preparing for festival, and no one more than glancing in his direction. The spring pole stood alone now, waiting. Bustle and childish shouts filled the side streets. All was as it should be, except that he was being watched. Then something led him to turn around, to raise his eyes. On the edge of the inn's tile roof perched a large raven, swaying a little in the gust wind from the mountains. Its head was cocked to the side, and one beady black eye was focused on him, he thought. He swallowed, and suddenly anger flickered in him, not hot and sharp. "Filthy carrion eater," he muttered. "I am tired of being stared at," Mat growled, and Rand realized his friend had stepped up beside him and was frowning at the raven too. They exchanged a glance. Then, as one, their hands darted for rocks. The two stones flew true, and the raven stepped aside. The stones whistled through space where it had been. Fluffing its wings once, it cocked its head again, fixing them with a dead black eye, unafraid, giving no sign that anything had happened. Rand stared at the bird in consideration. "Did you ever see a raven do that?" he asked quietly. Mat shook his head without looking away from the raven. "Never, nor any other bird either." "A vile bird," came a woman's voice from behind them. Mildious, despite echoes of distaste, to be mistrusted in the best of times. With a shrill cry, the raven launched itself into the air so violently that two black feathers drifted down from the roof's edge. Startled, Rand and Mat twisted to follow the bird's swift flight over the green and toward the cloud-tipped mountains of mist, tall beyond the westwood, until it dwindled to a speck in the west, then vanished from view. Rand's gaze fell to the woman who had spoken. She, too, had been watching the flight of the raven, but now she turned back and her eyes met his. He could only stare. This had to be the Lady Moraine, and she was everything that Mat and Eowyn had said. Everything and more. When he had heard she called Nynaeve child, he had pictured her as old, but she was not. At least, he could not put any age on her at all. At first he thought she looked as young as Nynaeve. The longer he looked, the more he thought she was older than that. There was a maturity about her large, dark eyes, a hint of knowing that no one could have gotten young. For an instant, he thought those eyes were deep pools about to swallow him up. It was plain why Mat and Eowyn named her a lady from a Gleeman's Tale, too. She held herself with a grace and air of command that made him feel awkward and stumble-footed. She was barely tall enough to come up to his chest, but her presence was such that her height seemed to the proper one, and he felt ungainly in his tallness. Although she was like no one he had ever seen before, the wide hood of her cloak framed her face and dark hair hanging in soft ringlets. He had never seen a grown woman with her hair unbraided. Every girl in the Two Rivers waited eagerly for the women's circle of her village to say she was old enough to wear a braid. Her clothes were just as strange. Her cloak was sky blue velvet, with thick silver embroidery, leaves and vines and flowers all along the edges. Her dress gleamed faintly as she moved, a darker blue than the cloak and slashed with cream. A necklace of heavy gold links hung around her neck, while another gold chain, delicate and fastened in her hair, supported a small sparkling blue stone in the middle of her forehead. A wide belt of woven gold encircled her waist, and on the second finger of her left hand was a gold ring in the shape of a serpent biting its own tail. He had certainly never seen a ring like that, though he recognized the great serpent, an even older symbol for eternity than the wheel of time. Fancier than any feast-day clothes, Eowyn had said, and he was right. No one ever dressed like that in the Two Rivers. Not ever. "Good morning, Mistress, Lady Moraine," Rand said. His face grew hot at his tongue's fumbling. "Good morning, Lady Moraine," Mat echoed somewhat more smoothly, but only a little. She smiled, and Rand found himself wondering if there was anything he might do for her, something that would give him an excuse to stay near her. He knew she was smiling at all of them, but it seemed meant for him alone. It really was just like seeing a Gleeman's Tale come to life. Mat had a foolish grin on his face. "You know my name," she said, sounding delighted, as if her presence, however brief, would not be the talk of the village for a year. "But you must call me Moraine, not Lady. And what are your names?" Eowyn leaped forward before either of the others could speak. "My name is Edwin Fingar, my lady. I told them your name. That's how they know. I heard Lan say it, but I wasn't eavesdropping. No one like you has ever come to Emond's Field before. There's a gleeman in the village for Beltane, too, and tonight it's winter night. Will you come to my house? My mother has apple cakes." "I shall have to see," she replied, putting a hand on Eowyn's shoulder. Her eyes twinkled with amusement, though she gave no other sign of it. "I do not know how well I could compete against a gleeman, Eowyn. But you must all call me Moraine." She looked expectantly at Rand and Mat. "I'm Matrim Cawthon. Moraine," Mat said. He made a stiff, jerking bow, then went red in the face as he straightened. Rand had been wondering if he should do something of the sort, the way men did in the stories, but with Mat's example, he merely spoke his name. At least he did not stumble over his own tongue this time. Moraine looked from him to Mat and back again. Rand thought her smile, a bare curve of the corners of her mouth, was now the sort Egwene wore when she had a secret. "I may have some small tasks to be done from time to time while I'm in Emond's Field," she said. "Perhaps you would be willing to assist me." She laughed as their accents tumbled over one another. "Here," she said, and tossed, and Rand was surprised when she pressed a coin into his palm, closing his hand tightly around it with both of hers. "There's no need," he began, but she waved aside his protest, as she gave Eowyn a coin as well, then pressed Mat's hand around one of the same way she did Rand's. "Of course there is," she said. "You cannot be expected to work for nothing. Consider this a token, and keep it with you, so you will remember that you have agreed to come to me when I ask it. There is a bond between us now." I'll never forget it, Owen piped up. Later we must talk, she said, and you must tell me all about yourselves. Moraine, Rand asked hesitantly as she turned away. She stopped and looked back over her shoulder, and he had to swallow before going on. Why have you come to Emond's Field? Her expression was unchanged, but suddenly he wished he had not asked. Though he could not have said why, he rushed to explain himself anyway. I don't mean to be rude. I'm sorry. It's just that no one comes into the Two Rivers except the merchants and peddlers when the snow isn't too deep to get down from Bear Lawn. Almost no one. Certainly no one like you. The merchants' guards sometimes say this is the back end of forever, and I suppose it must seem that way to anyone from outside. I was just wondering. Her smile did fade then, slowly, as if something had been recalled to her. For a moment she merely looked at him. I am a student of history, she said at last, a collector of old stories. This place you call the Two Rivers has always interested me. Sometimes I study the stories of what happened here long ago, here and at other places. Stories? Rand said. Whatever happened in the Two Rivers to interest someone like... what could have happened here? And what else would you call it beside the Two Rivers? Mat added. That's what it has always been called. As the wheel of time turns, Moraine said, half to herself, and with a distant look in her eyes, places wear many names. Men wear many names, many faces. Different faces, but always the same man. Yet no one knows the great pattern the wheel weaves, or even the pattern of an age. We can only watch and study and hope. Rand stared at her, unable to say a word, even to ask what she meant. He was not sure she had meant for them to hear. The other two were just as tongue-tied, he noticed, Elwyn's mouth hanging open. Moraine focused on them again, and all three gave a little shake as if waking up. Later, we will talk, she said. None of them said a word. Later. She moved on toward the wagon bridge, appearing to glide over the ground rather than walk, her cloak spreading on either side of her like wings. As she left, a tall man Rand had not noticed before moved away from the front of the inn and followed her, one hand resting on the long hilt of a sword. His clothes were a dark grayish green that would have faded into a leaf or shadow, and his cloak swirled through the shades of gray and green and brown as it shifted in the wind. It almost seemed to disappear at times, that cloak fading into whatever lay beyond it. His hair was long and gray at the temples, held back from his face by a narrow leather headband. That face was made from stony planes and angles, weathered but unlined despite the gray in his hair. When he moved, Rand could think of nothing but a wolf. In passing, the three youths, his gaze ran over them, eyes as cold and blue as a midwinter dawn. It was as if he were weighing them in his mind, and there was no sign on his face of what the scales told him. He quickened his pace until he caught up to Moraine, then slowed to walk by her shoulder, bending to speak to her. Rand let out a breath he had not realized he had been holding. That was Lan, Owen said throatily, as if he too had been holding his breath. It had been that kind of look. I'll bet he's a warder. Don't be a fool, Mat laughed, but it was a shaky laugh. Warders are just in stories anyway. Warders have swords and armor covered in gold and jewels, and spend all their time up north in the Great Blight fighting evil and Trollocs and such. He could be a warder, Owen insisted. Did you see any gold or jewels on him? Mat scoffed. Do we have Trollocs in the Two Rivers? We have sheep. I wonder what could ever happen here to interest someone like her. Something could have, Rand answered slowly. They say the inn's been here for 1,000 years, maybe more. 1,000 years of sheep, Mat said. A silver penny, Owen burst out. She gave me a whole silver penny. Think of what I can buy when the peddler comes. Rand opened his hand to look at the coin she had given him, and almost dropped it in surprise. He did not recognize the fat silver coin with the raised image of a woman balancing a single flame on her upturned hand, but he had watched while Bran Alver weighed out the coins merchants brought from a dozen lands, and he had an idea of its value. That much silver would buy a good horse anywhere in the Two Rivers, with some left over. He looked at Mat and saw the same stunned expression he knew must be on his face. Tilting his hand so Mat could see the coin, but not Eowyn, he raised a questioning eyebrow. Mat nodded, and for a minute they stared at one another in perplexed wonder. "What kind of chores does she have?" Rand asked finally. "I don't know," Mat said firmly, "and I don't care. I won't spend it either, even when the peddler comes." With that, he thrust his coin into his pocket. Nodding, Rand slowly did the same with his. He was not sure why, but somehow what Mat said seemed right. The coin should not be spent. Not when it came from her. He could not think of anything else silver was good for. But, "Do you think I should keep mine too?" Anguished indecision painted Eowyn's face. "Not unless you want to," Mat said. "I think she gave it to you to spend," Rand said. Eowyn looked at his coin, then shook his head and stuffed the silver penny into his pocket. "I'll keep it," he said mournfully. "There's still the Gleeman," Rand said, and the younger boy brightened. "If he ever wakes up," Mat added. "Rand," Eowyn asked, "is there a Gleeman?" "You'll see," Rand answered with a laugh. It was clear Eowyn would not believe it until he set his eyes on the Gleeman. "He has to come out the door sooner or later." Shouting drifted across the wagon bridge, and when Rand looked to see what was causing it, his laughter became wholehearted. A milling crowd of villagers, from gray-haired oldsters to toddlers barely able to walk, escorted a tall wagon toward the bridge. A huge wagon drawn by 8 horses. The outside of its rounded canvas cover hung with its bundles like bunches of grapes. The peddler had come at last. Strangers and a Gleeman, fireworks and a peddler. It was going to be the best Beltane ever.